as usual, I have these sort of cryptic titles that can take on a few different meanings, you know. I suppose realistically what I'm talking about is let's, on one hand, let's say the Enlightenment values that the West was built on, such as reason, debate, the separation of church and state, empiricism, mathematical inquiry. I'm sort of looking at those and other structures that the West was built upon, and how we seem to be turning back the clock on a lot of those values. So the ruin is the West, essentially. And those in exile are the people who perhaps realize this, you know. I mean, other people have had a few other interpretations. Some people have asked me, is it about the movement of people, migrants, refugees from all, not just recently, but throughout the last maybe 100 years, who are now exiled from a ruined state, which is not entirely what I meant, but is an interesting concept as well. It could be a personal exile from maybe a political ideal or a religious or spiritual belief. You know, it's kind of it's multi-layered, but my intention was really to symbolize the death or the end of what we can consider European classical civilization. In my opinion, part of what's been happening is that how can I explain? We have lost nearly all links to our pre-Christian past, with the exception of maybe some elements of like Norwegian culture or something like this. No, that's not entirely true to say. It's really about how a very great swathe of Western society has replaced any form of the process of gnosis, of spirituality, of even our, you know, even the medieval occultism that Europe was built on, have replaced any form of the process of spirituality. Because I believe the journey is important. I just don't believe that there's a destination. But we've replaced all of that with a decadent, amoral materialism, which is ripping the fabric of society apart. We've reached a stage where we've decided that a section of Western society has decided that nothing matters anymore. An almost postmodernist identity totalitarianism, where certain people have decided that we don't need any nations, any borders, any languages, any currency, any genders, anything. Nothing means anything anymore. So it's kind of really me. I mean, don't forget the lyrics. You know, there's poetic license there, but it's kind of me in a misanthropic way stating that we have replaced but any form of spiritual identity with an absolute nihilism. I wouldn't call myself a particularly spiritual person. I'm more of an observer of the. I believe that the process is important to the search for meaning that a person can give to their life. I don't believe there's a destination. I mean, fundamentally, I'm a man of science, but I suppose at least a scientific inquiry. So rationality wins out for me over the existence of the supernatural. But at the same time, the process of gnosis, I think, you know, and what that can reveal to people about their place within the world is very important. And I also think that, I mean, look, Ireland has a very complicated history with a very dark institution, with the Catholic Church. So when I talk about these things, some people ask me, Are you talking about going back into time in the 20s or the 50s in Ireland? Because nobody wants that. They're very dark times. So I'm not talking, but that's not exactly what I'm talking about. I'm talking about less the institutions of religious oppression than the actual personal journey of spiritual awareness which some people can undertake to try and find a place for themselves, and take in within that the what could you call the spiritual architecture of the West. I reference Occidental magic in that song. Occidental, which is the West.
Okay.
Yeah, well, there's the Orient, which is the East. So I became very interested, of course, in things like, I'm very interested in things like alchemy and that kind of stuff, at least, this process from this dividing line between magic and science. And so, Isaac Newton and all these kind of people. And I believe that those people are part of the structure that modern Western society is built upon. So what I'm trying to say maybe with this album is that I think that Europe, the West, let's say, has a sickness, a malady. It's lost any form of belief in the positive values that its society, that its structures can represent. Basically, let's be honest, being a white Western male has become a term of negative connotation. It's also the nonsense. Yeah, it's also the nonsense of intersectionality. It's the nonsense of absolute meaningless in a postmodern world. It's the nonsense of the nonsense of collective guilt. It's all these intellectual cul-de-sacs that are designed in the modern age to stop debate, to say, we don't listen to you because of who you are, not because of what you say. And again, for me, these are, as I said, intellectual dead ends that go against what should be the teachings of a Western society. So I don't want the whole album. The album is more an observation. It's not me. It's not written from right or left. I'm not doing that. It's more an observation. It is an ongoing process of decay. Tell me there won't be some form of civil war in France in a couple of years. I don't know. Look, I had a conversation with a kid in America. I guess he was in his early 20s. And he said to me, we need a Marxist revolution in America. And I said, really, a Marxist revolution? He said, yes, the workers need to take back their companies. We need, this, that, and the other. And I said to him, man, there's 320 million people in this country. And you know how many guns there are in this country. And I said to him, are you advocating bloodshed on the streets? Because that's what would happen. And he just kind of said, yeah, this is, the better future for American society. And I said, well, be careful of what you advocate, because this world is in a very strange and difficult place. And upon your words are built tyranny and genocide. And I like to bring very often the argument down to the most dark place it can go to prove a point, like a hammer blow. And I said to him, look, man, last year I was in Cambodia. I stood in the killing fields and looked at the dried blood on a tree stump where they had smashed open babies' heads. And in 4 years they killed, whatever it is, 3.7 million people. And that is your U0. That's your Marxist revolution. No, it's not real Marxism, he said. I said, well, I don't, if people and all of their flaws are going to be involved in your idealistic crusade, then who's to say that won't happen? As he looked at me like kind of, that's not really what I'm saying. And I said, well, man, I'm sure Hutus and Tutsis who've been living side by side for years didn't think they'd be macheting each other to death within a 24-hour period. You know, I'm sure during the Balkan Wars, people lived side by side. And here we are, Serbs and Croats, and, you know, I mean, as I said to him, be careful what you wish for. And it's obvious that he'd never spoken to anybody who didn't kind of toe the line with his, you know, sort of, as I said, postmodernist view of the world, where they can get away with saying things like that. But I also understand that for a young person, millennial, the old sense of community that existed is kind of gone. Their tribe is online, and activism is their opiate. And if you say to them, "Hey, can you put that crack pipe down?" they'll say, "But I like this." And this is what I understood. They like making the flyers and going out with ski masks on and being in a powerful gang on the street. And they like the activism is the opiate. And if you say to somebody, "Hey, you know that thing that you've been really, really into? It doesn't really stand for anything, and all it does is create division in society. Could you put it down?" They will say, "Maybe not, probably not," because it's their tribe, you know. And he was stuck in a difficult place where he'd met someone who'd been in Russia and Belarus and the Ukraine and stood in the Ukraine famine memorial and seen the results of enforced starvation by Stalin, who'd stood there, and he'd never been even outside the USA, and someone who'd been to Cambodia, but yet refused to concede to me that I might know more about the world. And that's part of the problem. If you're 19 years old, you don't tell the world how to be because you haven't lived enough yet. And we're allowing some of the structures of society to be defined by, in my opinion, young people who don't know enough of the world yet, you know. Jeremy Corbyn is, and who his previous associates were in the 1970s and 1980s. He also cozied up to the IRA, and most, I suppose, well, the IRA is Marxist in theory as well. I mean, look, you know, this again, it's the what this all does is the rehabilitation of a murder cult like Stalinism, or, you know, I mean, when you actually speak to, like when I spoke to this guy in America, I said, like, you need to travel around Eastern Europe and say that those are the things you think the world needs, because it's very easy from a middle class, leafy academic place in America to, you know, and let's be honest, kids who go to college in America are a privileged bunch of people. They're the people accusing other people of being privileged, but they are the privileged few. And as I said to him, man, go and visit the last dictatorship in Europe, Belarus, and, you know, or all across the shattered old countries in Eastern Europe. I mean, visit Albania, Moldova, whatever you want, and yeah, the Ukraine. I mean, and you'll see what the ethos that you aspire to has delivered to these people. You know, I mean, I've been to Russia several times, and I think it's a bit more complicated in Russia because I think that the free market destroyed that country in a different way. And there's a very great sense in Russia that a once great world power became literally a laughingstock, you know. And the people are quite hurt, shall we say, by the lack of power that the country has anymore. And I think that Putin provides a sort of patriotic antidote to that, which puts Russia in a slightly different case. But like, as you know, than the countries that communism oppressed in the Eastern Bloc. But I got the impression with this kid, he was never taught this in school. He never heard of this, you know, enforced Stalinist famine in the Ukraine, or I don't think they are at all. Or are they? I was telling him about Solzhenitsyn and the Gulag Archipelago, and I couldn't really get through to him. You know, and even you can notice in the Western media attempts at rehabilitating North Korea. Well, look, I mean, it's a trend. But one thing you have to understand with one thing you have to understand with a lot of people, and let's call them on the new left, you know, I have to be careful with these interviews because I have to be careful what I say and how I'm painted, because there's certain people who will take things that I say, for example, criticizing Marxist theory, and immediately assume that I'm a fascist or something. I'm not talking about about you or this interview or something, but the point is this: is that what I realized very clearly after talking to people on the new left, I consider myself on the old left, which would have been in this country, housing, healthcare, education, all those kind of old, fair rent, or this whatever you want to call old principles from the 70s and 80s before the left became hijacked by the middle class bourgeoisie. I realized that to them, everything they disagree with is fascism. The patriarchy is fascism. Globalism is fascism. Capitalism is fascism. Anything I said, the guy was basically like, well, and I said, hey, explain to me how capitalism is fascism. But that's the way they see it. And, intersectionality provides them with the perfect excuse to never speak to anybody like me, because they've decided that any view that I might hold is obviously comes from that place. And it's a very dangerous intellectual, like I said, cul-de-sac when you say to somebody, we have no reason to discuss this because of who you are. Because that eventually means that you will have to conquer the people that you disagree with and not reach, a sort of impasse with them. So that's you're setting up your stall for conflict as opposed to resolution. And I don't really think that people like that realize what they're doing. So I don't know, like the whole thing is tied. Not all the songs on the album are like that. We have to make a division between how I politically look at the world and how Primordial does. I don't speak for everyone, and the lyrics are very often, they're observational. They're observing states of mind. They're observing the passing of states and nations. They're observing how we relate to all these things, So, but we are at some very dangerous place in the world's history. We think to ourselves, let's say the 1960s. They say denim jeans brought down the Berlin Wall, and there is an element of truth to that flippant comment. Is that what the 1960s counterculture represented was a movement of, let's say, freedom from institutions on some level. But I think that it was a positive thing, but also now, 40 years later, 50 years later, we're seeing the seeds, like how we say, the negative seeds of that 1960s revolution are flowering, so to speak. And that is, I think, the fact that academia was left to the postmodernists and post-Marxists to teach in for the last 30 years. And just like the House of Saud built mosques all across Europe that taught Wahhabism, the schools and academia across the West have been teaching, as you say, this nihilism. And now we have as this nihilistic generation who don't believe, in my opinion, in the worth of family or the worth of, like we've thrown all of the positive values, for example, of my grandparents' generation out the window. We've decided nothing that they stood for was worthwhile. But from my side, my grandparents were in the RAF and fought in the Second World War. How ironic that the same people who are jumping up and down screaming about fascism, who accuse everything of the past of being, written by victors and meaning nothing, also would decry the values of an entire generation who actually fought the very thing that they claim to be against, which I find mind-boggling. But everything is full of conceit now. What black metal is, black metal is a subculture, a byproduct, once distilled 40, 50 years down, of heavy metal, of rebellion, it's easy to read what you're saying into it, and I totally understand. But also it's an artistic expression, and we do have to recognize that artistic expression in the face of a staid, tired, post-World War II world that needed to happen. There needed to be a form of sexual revolution. I mean, no one wanted to live in the Ireland of 1960. Believe me, it was a backwards, intellectually stunted place. But I think what's happened is that we've burnt the roast. You know, we've over egged the pudding, whatever you want to. I don't know. I'm trying to. And now the negative seeds of my parents' generation have become twisted into something like. Yeah, I mean, even Pol Pot, coming back to Cambodia, Pol Pot was educated in the Sorbonne. He was educated. Yes. He was educated in middle-class Paris. In the same, he was educated there. He traveled to Cambodia as a middle-class man, part of their upper-class set, and decided to form the Khmer Rouge in almost revenge at the upper classes because a woman scorned his advances. But what the fuck am I talking about that for? No, my point was that, again, he came from an academic set that was preaching, as you say, these postmodern, post-Marxist values, you know, and he decided, well, I'm going to go to my country and explore that. So, I don't know, I understand what you mean, but maybe also perhaps the world needs that colour as well. The colour that black metal, among other things. You know, I mean, you know, it's as an artistic expression, it has its worth, without a doubt. We all don't have to agree with the message. What do you really know about alienation? And yeah, if you're from a leafy suburb in Stockholm, I understand what you mean. I mean, there's so many different reasons why these things happen. Maybe the fact is that music for some of those countries in the north was not only an antidote to long winters and boredom, but the simple fact that musical teaching was encouraged in those kids at a young age, and they grew up with music, and something like black or death metal in Northern Europe is almost second nature in a comfortable society, and therefore the music is not necessarily created to escape or to deal with problems or deal with those kind of things, you know. But we also have to acknowledge that, like, fundamentally, overanalyzing. I mean, I did a lecture about black metal in a college here, and I said, look, first things first, you can't intellectualize a punch in the face, and we're dealing with very often young men making heavy metal, and I mean, let's say if we boil it down to that, and all the things that young men idolize, believe in.
Sure.
It's just that, you know, then striving to find an intellectual worth within it all now, because that's the trend, is I don't know whether that's quite realistic. You know? I don't know. Let's make it more broad. Is rock and roll an element of postmodernism? I don't think so. I had a big conversation, for example, with Keith from Destroyer 666 about this very thing, and he was saying to me, man, this last 20 odd years has been a great indulgence, but isn't it an indulgence part of the trap of the things that we talk about? And I said, well, you know, for me, Primordial set out our stall differently. We always had this historical, cultural purchase. So, I mean, I can stand behind what I've created and say, in my own small way, I think it's a continuation of a great Irish lit, and, you know, if you want, of just in general literary and artistic tradition. It's not based in fantasy or nihilism or Satanism or any of these things. And I said, look, man, you know, we shouldn't apologize for being reckless and out of control. And you know, but he did raise a very good question. He was just like, is this indulgence we're part of? Is it part of the problem? And that's when you'll notice it, I think, especially in a band like Destroyer, the lyrics and the tone I think especially Keith trying to change to, if we consider something part of the problem, do we consider that there's a solution and therefore it shouldn't exist? Of course it. No, I do take it's fundamental. See, I mean, look, you know, we can also say, if we wanted to, I've been doing a lot of studying lately about the Rosicrucians and about, say, 15th century European occultism. I mean, is black metal a modern equivalent of a continuation on some level of at that process of gnosis, I mean, there is a very great occult tradition within the West. So it depends. I know what you're getting at, and it's a point I've been grappling with as well, because fundamentally then, underneath that, what we're saying is that the trappings of the 1960s counterculture and rock and roll have ultimately proved to be a negative influence. And I would be hard pressed to really view things like that, because on their own senses they fueled the ideal of Western hegemony for the last 50, 60 years. They've pushed technological boundaries, they've pushed, you know what I mean? And also on a simple level, I'm very wary of becoming a Puritan, you know. It's a very good question that I find myself on either side of where the line in the sand is, because I've done some incredibly rock and roll things in my history with Primordial, but yet also I've stood on stage in front of thousands of people and sang songs about the Irish famine. So it's hard to square the circle completely. You know, I think you're onto something. You know, like art and entertainment, there's a division between those two things, and this kind of stuff. This is what we are about, but we don't ask other bands to be about the same kind of thing. But it's yeah, you're right. Most heavy metal doesn't want to go to these places. You know, it's no doubt it will end up with me being in trouble, but that's usually what happens anyways. People will just see me for who, see me and decide, this is another person that we should try and put in their place and bring down in our... There's science and biology is quite defined, and it's very complicated and very murky water to get into right now. But I do believe that certain sections of the very, very far left of the modern, feminist movement, or whatever you want to call it. I think they are being, I think certain areas of that movement, the LGBT movement, are being used by darker forces, and that a darker fundament of that is the view that the family equals the patriarchy. And so therefore, the movement to undermine what the family represents at all costs is a driving narrative for, and I mean a tiny minority, but a quite vocal and powerful minority of that section. The attempt to portray heterosexuality as some kind of
like oppressive,
regressive lifestyle. Yeah, I mean, look, I don't care who fucks who. I really couldn't give a shit. Fuck who you want. I couldn't care less about it. I think if that's ultimately all that defines you, then that's a little bit sad, considering the wealth and riches of the idealism of the world. But I really couldn't care less about any of that stuff. But the policing of language is a cornerstone of tyranny. To me, I'm a free speech absolutist. There is no such thing as hate speech. There's only speech. And if you believe there is hate speech, then you are a whisker away from thought crime. And we are entering into some Orwellian dystopia that people need to read 1984, you know. They need to understand that very, very soon, through AI technology, and our very bodies are going to be linked to social networking. And so the thought of thought crime is really not that, it's not science fiction anymore. Already, if you've linked all your social networking, you obviously know the internal algorithm of social networking.
Yes.
Very precisely determines even just the internet determines what you use, who you speak, what you view, and it's open and for everyone to see, and it drives the marketing algorithm. And the other thing I've been saying in interviews all week is, first things first, let's understand that the divisions in society are created in order very much to drive this algorithm. That this division is driven by institutions, peoples, companies, whatever you want to call it, who profit from this, from society being diametrically opposed to each other. And it's basically a sort of doomsday algorithm, in my opinion, you know. So standing and listening to people who are teaching children in colleges stand up and accuse them of this thing or that thing. I mean, some of them, they might as well be teaching flat earth theory in college, you know. If you're going to be anti-biology, anti-science, especially anti-science, like anti-scientific, I think we're living in an era of, I call it like how we feel-ism, where we prize how we feel about a subject more than the empirical data that's contained within. How you feel about it doesn't matter. About these things doesn't matter. What matters is the at times upsetting truth that can be revealed by the science within the subject. There's no room for everything has become hyper emotional, hypersexual. Everyone is hypersensitive, and I think what it's doing is it's creating a society that is only finds its self-worth in victimhood. You know.